supposed to talk about the hoof ground interaction, and I want to expand that a little bit to Fetlock hoof, and I want to explain a little bit why. If anybody has any questions, stop me along the way. Because I'm unclear whether I'll get through this whole thing. I want to share my take-home messages right at the beginning. And the first is that Fetlock and hoof kinematics are definitely related to the behavior, that's mechanical behavior of the surface, as opposed to strictly type or composition. So surface mechanical behavior relies on more than surface type. So we talked about dirt, synthetic, and turf, and there's so much variability in our experience among those different surfaces that it's not as useful as understanding the surface material properties, the surface structure. So it's not as simple, and I know you guys already know this, I'm not sure what I'm talking about, other than I have to remind myself. The structure is important and the maintenance, and we've done a little bit of horseshoes, we have an opportunity with horseshoes modifying the interaction with surface materials. So building on what Peter Hitchens said yesterday, which I think is really important, is our injuries most of them are the result of fatigue, that is repetitive loads. And if I have a stick, if I'm not strong enough to break it in a single load, I can wiggle it and wiggle it and wiggle it until it gets enough damage that it'll break at a lower load. And the same thing is happening in our horses. Just an example, this is a humerus from a racehorse that died from this catastrophic fracture. We take a look at it with scanning electron microscopy at one of the trabecula coming off the cortical shell, and pretend that cortex is a tree trunk. That trabecula coming off the inside is a tree branch. And if you jump up and down on that branch, what would you expect to happen? You expect it to buckle underneath. You expect it to split on the top. And it's just to illustrate, this is happening all the time in our bones. So that's the process of fatigue. And I know this happened before the fracture because it's already healing. It's bridging. And so as the horse is being trained, gets some damage, but always trying to catch up with the healing process. This was said 2 or 3 times yesterday, but I can't emphasize it enough. There's a nonlinear relationship between load magnitude and the cycles it takes to break bone or stick anything else, which means that up here, you can see my arrow, the highest loads have an inordinately large effect on reducing the number of strides that horse can take. So why do we care about Fetlock in addition to hoof motion? Two reasons. Oops, here. One is that most of our injuries occur in the Fetlock, but hoof motions and pastern motions influence Fetlock motion, and that's because the soft tissue structures cross more than one joint, and motions of the pastern and the hoof are going to influence the Fetlock as well. And just to give a brief example of that, this radiograph shows Fetlock hyperextension. We've got the cannon bone, the pastern bones, the coffin bone, and we have the sesamoid bones on the back of the Fetlock. They're supported by soft tissues, but when the Fetlock hyperextends, we get abnormal motion between those bones, which focuses or concentrates stresses, load transfer, and that gives us our micro damage, which weakens the bone and gets propagational failure. So that's why we care about it and I talk about it. So I also mentioned one thing after Peter Hitchens' talk yesterday, and I think what she said is really important. Here we're looking at 127 horses that fractured their proximal sesamoid bones versus 148 that did not. You look at their exercise history before fracture occurred or didn't occur, and the red line are horses that fractured, the blue line are horses that didn't. And what we can see from the steep slope is that the horses that fracture require many more high-speed furlongs than those that don't fracture. And the key here is injuries develop over time. These horses are accumulating damage at too high of a rate, and we're interested in, for every furlong or every stride they take, what the load magnitude is, so we can quantify their likelihood for fracture. Now, this is the same red line and blue line, but I've expanded the number of high distance furlongs because we're following 13 horses here. And the ones in black, and these horses were at Racetrack A until the very end when they moved to Racetrack B. So within the first week or 10 days of racing at Racetrack B, 13 horses broke down. All of them in black are the ones that broke down because of fetlock injury. And this is why I say that Racetrack B took all the blame for horses that were primed to break down before they ever got there. So the key messages here, the surface is really important over time. We care about limb loading over time, but we have to be careful about who we blame when the actual catastrophic breakdown occurs.
Does the change in surface expedite the situation?
It can. I would speculate to say a healthy horse will not break down on a compromised surface.
Correct, yes.
If you have a compromised surface and you have a horse that's already at risk, it may put them over the edge.
Gotcha.
All right.
What if the surface isn't compromised, it's just different?
It's still.
Its composition's different, it's.
Could be.
Okay.
Could play a factor. They get a different type of load, they can have a different type of load profile on that surface.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask one question? The original, let's call it nonlinear chart about load versus, I guess it's a short way of asking, is every high speed furlong the same or different, right? Like if I'm doing, if I go 44 and 1, that's different than going 49 and 1, or not?
No, they are different. If the surface is the same,
yeah,
faster the speed, the higher the load.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Okay, so it's some combination of distance times exertion or something.
Yeah, it's exactly. The faster the speed, the higher the load. And then we look at the number of cycles at those high loads. And then we look at the number of cycles, I didn't put this in here, relative to the time frame because of the ability of the horse to heal. And so essentially you get them coming too fast, too often, and the healing process can't be right. So they get enough accumulated damage, and trying to repair their events that happen when we remove the damage that create porosities and weakness in the bone.
Got it.
So rest would reset somewhat. I mean, a period of time of rest, not just,
Yeah, this is a longer conversation, but if you strictly lay them up, that's bad. But if you give them time to recover between high speed events,
Okay.
and also it only takes a certain number of cycles for bone to see new strains. So you can train a horse probably with fewer cycles than people think of those high speed events. So there are a lot of things that interact and play a role here.
Yeah, no, I would figure that.
So I'm gonna keep going.
I'm sorry.
No, I love this. I love it. Because understanding these features helps us understand why we care about the surface and what factors we care about. So I hope this is helpful, and this is a little bit outside of.
No, it's spot on, because that's what I always used to tell the superintendents is, your job isn't to maintain the track, it's reduce musculoskeletal disease in the horse. And that matters, and I've had this discussion, especially with people in training centers, that are poorly maintained. And that's it's damaging at the racetrack, especially when you're putting young horses on. No, I think this is very relevant.
All right. So, and the lovely thing about racetrack surfaces is that you can manage them. But the other thing is it affects all horses. I mean, there aren't many other interventions to affect the whole entire population. So that's incredible. So we have an instrumented horseshoe that we've, maybe this will go, that we use on horses, both trotting for the video, but galloping on different surfaces. And at one point in time, early on, we measured when Keelan put Polytrack for their training surface. And you're looking at two strides of the horse, vertical impact forces between the track and the hoof are illustrated for each of those different surfaces. And you don't need to see the scale, but it is the same. You can see that the magnitude of force transfer between the different surfaces varies a lot amongst these surfaces. And in particular, the dirt surface has higher forces than the synthetic surface. So we looked at how that might affect fetlock angle between a dirt surface and a synthetic surface. And essentially, we have, a lot of people in this room do this probably much better than we do, but following kinematic markers. And if I keep it moving. So here we're just looking at the hind limb fetlock, and during the course of the stride, we can track what happens to fetlock angle. And again, I care about fetlock angle because of propensity for damaging structures in the joint. So we do the same thing, show a video on this is a dirt surface, I think. But when we compare the dirt and synthetic surfaces, we can see that the high fetlock has a markedly different, higher fetlock extension. Peak occurs in a different time in this particular study, and that correlates well with the impact forces on these different surfaces. So we can also track what happens with the hoof in the ground surface, so we can follow the heel and the toe, and as their displacement in the surface doing the same thing. Here we go. So here we're following as the hoof moves into the surface, it slides forward, it begins to rotate in the ground as it's starting to propel the horse forward, and then we get right over and toe off. And have a similar thing for the synthetic surface. And we know that marked differences in how the hoof interacts with the surface. In this instance, there's what we probably all already relate to is that synthetic surface is much grabbier. The hoof moves a lot less in the surface than the dirt surface. It affects the support phase so that the support is much longer on the synthetic surface. So we get the hoof stops, it stays there for a long time. The load profile on the limb is different with different hoof movements through the surface. And not only that, the stability of the hoof within the surface is different between the two different surfaces. So we've got the dirt surface, the hoof is really hunting for stability, and the synthetic surface is fairly stable. We've looked at two other disciplines, and the same sort of thing holds. These are elite massage forces at the extended trot. And so we use a similar vertical impact tester that's much simpler than the ODST. And if we look at the load displacement profiles of those impacts on the ground, we can see the scales are the same on the synthetic surface above, the dirt surface below, but interestingly enough, the synthetic surface was just almost hard as a rock. They never worked it was hard packed, and the impact forces were greater. And correspondingly, fetlock extension was much higher on the synthetic surface than on the dirt surface. So the same relationship holds, and importantly, it's more related to the behavior of the surface than the surface itself and how it's managed. So, race surfaces are made of many different layers, so we can characterize the behavior of a material, or the behavior of the surface is the composite behavior of not only the cushion, for example, but the pad, the base, and things that are underneath it. So what we've done, and this is our vertical impact device, it's fairly simple, measures the same things, but doesn't consider dampening of the Fetlock, for example. But we've done computer models of impacts to the surface. And here's our computer simulation and an actual overlay with the actual force displacement impact. And we can model the surface based on displacement through the cushion, elastic and dissipated behaviors of the pad. So we've got cushion down here, we've got pad in this location. So what that allowed us to do was to incorporate behavior of different surfaces in a musculoskeletal model that we have of the forelimb, in which we state the initial conditions, the horse is now moving at this velocity, and then forward dynamic simulations tell us what happens to the limb when it interacts with these different surfaces. And so, for example, this is a simulation where what you're seeing here, the soft tissue structure is supporting the bones, but the hoof penetrating the top portion of the surface, and the blue lines are the ground reaction forces. So with that type of simulation, we can determine the sensitivity of, in this case, we're going to talk about Fetlock angle because I care so much about Fetlock angle, two different features of the surface, which include, in this particular study, cushion depth, stiffness, so the cushion in the pad, and horizontal friction. And the good news is that our simulations correspond fairly well to actual data that we collect, and that's basically what this is trying to show. And we recognize that the stiffer the surface, the greater we have maximum Fetlock angle extension. And so what we're looking at here, both dirt in red, synthetic in blue, and compacted and harrowed surfaces. But basically the key feature is we care about stiffness, load rate, relative to maximum Fetlock angle, because it makes a difference on limb kinematics, propensity for injury. However, this graph, again, looking at different sensitivities of things, cushion depth ended up, because the slope of this right-hand border is more than the slope of this left-hand border, cushion depth is actually playing quite a large role in comparison to cushion stiffness and what happens to the limb. We also looked at horizontal friction, different parameters, and a little bit to my surprise, and again, these are simulating certain conditions, not every condition. So I'm just trying to show examples of both how factors affect this, but also the spectrum that you can look at. But a little bit to my surprise in this particular model, the horizontal component of friction that we did not have a great effect on Fetlock angle. I guess that's a good thing, I'm not sure. So relative to changing these different parameters that we saw when we measured them, cushion depth played a huge role, pad stiffness second, the cushion depth, then pad stiffness, cushion stiffness, and friction. So we know already that when we measure these mechanical properties, different types of surfaces have highly varying differences in peak force or rate stiffness. And in a different study where we were looking at limb kinematics, show jumping horses, and I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on the next thing, is that, if I can get myself to advance the slide. We looked at a lot of 12 different arena surfaces, and the things, and this lab, and Caleb in particular, helped us a lot with measuring the components of the surface. I'm just briefly trying to get through this, so I apologize if I'm being anal here. So we measure the vertical impact properties, and we think it's really important that we do second drops because the first time the horse goes over the surface, it impacts the surface, you get compaction of the aerated material, and it's a very different surface the second time the second horse goes over it. Now, in our version of measuring shear, as opposed to incorporating in the OBSP, is actually to do a separate shear test, where we actually either use both a grouser to determine material shear components as well as a surrogate hoof to measure shear at the interface of the hoof and the surface material. And so basically, if we're looking at shear of our surrogate hoof, we're looking at adhesion, coefficient of friction. If we're looking at the material properties, we're looking at cohesion and angle of internal friction. But trying to skip through a lot of stuff, we care about the composition because the composition is affecting these properties of how the hoof moves through the surface. So if we look at dirt versus synthetic, there's so much variation in the material properties that we get few relationships. But when we start looking at components of the surface and properties of that, then we do get relationships. And similarly, we really care about how compacted the surface becomes, which is why I asked about some impacts. And in you studying these different surfaces, you guys already know this. I don't even know why I'm talking about it, except we find the same things, that monitoring, but being able to manage pushing depth and water content plays a big role on the shear properties of the surface. And we find better relationships with those properties and your management than we do with just thinking about them generically. And the same thing with vertical ground reaction forces. So the last thing I want to just mention is we've looked at using different shoes on our shear testing devices with different surfaces. Here, just an N01 of each. And just to highlight maybe a couple of things, that shoes, I think we have a huge opportunity with innovation of shoes if you really think about it. Just like human athletics, you're going to use different shoes for different things. And we find that differences between shoes are more dramatic on synthetic surfaces, probably because of grip and interaction than they are on dirt surfaces. And so what we use, on the horse's foot is probably going to be another opportunity for making differences in the load rate that the opponent sees. So sometimes I just get on my soapbox, so I'm not sure. I hope some of that was helpful. But we care about the things you guys are measuring a lot, and we care about the ability to incorporate those in models of developing injury in horses and making them. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.